All right, well, this morning, like I said, the topic is going to be on nakedness. And I know y'all are like, ooh, really? Yeah, you don't want to picture this naked. I get that. Nakedness, today we're going to talk about that and the return of the Lord. And there was a couple of things that when I started, I was reading through, I've read through the Bible once this year, and I kind of started again on a second time. I have a lot of time to, and I cheat, okay, because I get to listen to it through my radio when I'm traveling. So a lot of times when I'm driving to Knoxville or Morristown and I have 3-hour window, I can put, my phone on my Bible and it'll read the Bible to me. So I get to kind of cheat as I go through, but I consider that reading as I'm listening. And so I do it as much as I can. And one of the things I noticed was, I'll get into that in a bit, is nakedness. And it was when you're in the first part of Genesis, and I'll show you, there's only a couple of times in the Bible that it even talks about nakedness. And there's reasons for that. The Bible doesn't put it in there for no reason whatsoever. And so that's why I started kind of wondering when I first heard the first one, and then I actually found it somewhere else and want to talk about that today. But anyway, if you read in Genesis, you'll note how often the early chapters of Genesis talk about nakedness. But why? And so that's what we're going to study about. I also noticed that Revelation speaks of nakedness in a couple of prominent places as well. And then I also found it in one other place. We'll talk about that. But during the week, I was listening to a pastor, and I think this is kind of what sparked it, because as I was going through again, I'd heard this guy speaking, and he'd talked about it a little bit, but then it kind of triggered something with me. So he spoke of the Jewish background to the key verse of Revelations that mentions nakedness and shame. So I kind of felt like, why is all this coming up at one time? Why this? And as I did this study, I really understood a little bit more, and I never really put a lot of thought to it. So this is the result. We want to look at today the reasons Genesis mentions nakedness so often, an obscure yet interesting reference to a young man being naked in the Gospels, why a church was said to be naked in Revelation, and nakedness and shame in relation to the return of Jesus and the judgment seat of Christ. So it's all, I don't want to say pictures because that's not something we want to imagine a lot of times, but it's types and foreshadows. And so all of it makes sense once we get in there. So let's start. We'll start in Genesis 2 and 25. I had done a bunch of studies that were comparing, and I did a few of them in here, comparing Genesis to Revelation. And you can see how the book starts and how the book ends and how you can tie them together. And this was one I had started a while back, and then it never went anywhere. And like I said, after I heard this pastor, I kind of went a little further with it. But Genesis 2 and 25 says, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." Is that right? No. Yeah, that's right. Okay.
Chapter 24.
Thank you. And they were both naked. Thank you. I couldn't even read my own hand right now. All right. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. Genesis 3:7 says, "Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings." And then in Genesis 3:9 and 11, it said, or 9 through 11, it says, "Then the Lord called unto the man and said to him, Where are you? He said, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked. So I hid myself." And he said, "Who told you you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?" So we see from the pictures above that being naked and finding out that they were naked played an important part in the early chapters of Genesis. So from the scriptures that we just read, nakedness in Genesis 2 and 3, the last verse and thought mentioned in the Bible before the temptation and fall of Adam was that they were naked and not ashamed. So the first thought that Adam and Eve had after they fell was what? They were ashamed. And then the first action of Adam and Eve after the fall was to try to cover their nakedness. And the first action of Adam and Eve in relation to God was to hide themselves from Him in fear because of their nakedness. So why the emphasis on nakedness? That's what we're going to look at. I think it's twofold. Before the fall, they were naked and not ashamed, showing us that they lived in perfect innocence and weren't focused in any way on themselves. Shame comes from a knowledge, doesn't it? Shame comes from a knowledge of an evil, but pre-fall, there was no evil, right? So before they fell, there was no evil in the world. So they had no idea that they were naked. This was how they were created. Shame comes after the fall. And at that stage, they took as much notice of their nakedness as a cat would today as she wanders outside, right? They didn't care. They didn't think about it before the fall. But that changed once they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Sin had entered in, and suddenly their eyes were on themselves. And that's very important. When we sin, most of the time when we sin, almost all the time we sin, it's because we've taken our eyes off God and we've gotten our eyes on ourselves, right? We're thinking about ourselves. We're thinking about bettering ourselves. We're thinking of, or not bettering, trying to get ahead. We're thinking about selfish things. And that's what causes us to take our eyes off God and what causes us to sin in the first place. And then that's what brings shame to ourselves. This key thought of suddenly seeing themselves as naked is both physical and spiritual. That's why I said it's twofold. There's an overwhelming feeling of being exposed, both physically and spiritually speaking. Their fall into sin from their pure innocence is now exposed. And so they hide, quickly covering themselves with fig leaves, as if that could ever cover their sin and shame. First off, I want to know how they sewed fig leaves together. That sounds pretty impressive. All right, I can't sew. My wife can't sew. We would have still been standing there holding the fig leaf over us because we wouldn't have had anything to put on. Okay, I'm just going to say that. We'd have been in a lot of trouble. But that's where it begins. For now, we remember this as we proceed. The key thought in relation to nakedness in Genesis, post-fall, is in relation to shame. It's the thought of being exposed before the Lord and not having His covering. Because see, when they were innocent, they had His covering of innocence. But after the fall, they no longer had that, did they? They had to find something else to cover their shame, and that's what they were trying to do. With this thought in mind, let's look at an obscure passage in the Gospels. Now, this was something that I ran across when I was, you do your little studies of where's nakedness in the Bible. This was one I thought was really weird after I started studying this. And then I realized there was a much more spiritual point to this. So here's a question for you. How many times do you think naked or nakedness is found in the Gospels? In the new Gospels in the New Testament? One time.
Yeah.
Just in there one time. And you would think, that word would probably come up more often than that, but it doesn't. Mark 14, 48 through 52. I'll let you get there if you want to. Mark 14, 48 through 52. Jesus said to them, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as you would against a robber? Every day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But this has taken place to fulfill the Scriptures." And they all left him and fled. A young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body. And they seized him, but he pulled free of the linen sheet and escaped naked. Okay? So, now, most people believe that this unnamed young man following Jesus was Mark himself, the author. We really don't have a whole lot to qualify that, but most people kind of believe it was Mark. As I read the passage, I thought, why include this story at all? Why would this be in there? And it's not like Mark was chatting with a friend saying, "Boy, you won't believe what happened to me today. This guy grabbed my clothes, ripped them off, and as I ran away, I ran through the streets naked." Now, that's not some story you'd probably tell everybody. Might be kind of funny to see, but it's just kind of a weird story to have it put in there. And it would be embarrassing, you would think. And it would be a day that he probably wouldn't forget anytime soon. I know if you saw me running through the streets naked, you're probably not going to forget that. You're going to wish you could, but you're probably not going to forget that anytime soon. He is writing a letter to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. So why would Mark include this event? This event is an outward event that has a spiritual application. Remember that nakedness is related to shame, both naturally and spiritually. When you read the whole chapter and note the context, I think it becomes clear. Note the following from Mark 14. Only hours previously, Jesus and his disciples had the Last Supper together, where Jesus told him that he would be betrayed and that they would all fall away. He quoted the prophet Zechariah, who stated, "Strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered." That was from Mark 14:27. Peter and then all of the disciples responded by saying what? "We would never leave you. We would never do any of that. We would go to death before we would do that." That was in Mark 14:29 and 31. Straight after this bold declaration, Jesus took James, John, and Peter to the Garden of Gethsemane in the most important hour where he stated that his soul was overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. He asked his disciples to stay alert, right? And what did they do? They fell asleep. 3 times they fell asleep on their watch. After we have the betrayal of Jesus, the last thing said of the disciples before this incident of nakedness was, all had left him and fled. Mark 14 ends with Peter lying even to the servant girl, saying he didn't know Jesus, just as the cock crowed 3 times. So why include this story of losing your clothing and being naked in the midst of all this? It's an outward event of an inward spiritual reality. When you start looking at why would this be in there? I mean, we don't have trivial stuff put in the Bible for any reason, right? Nothing in here is trivial. When God puts it in here, he puts it in here for a reason. So there's a reason this event takes place in here. All of them had spiritual shame of nakedness. Despite their talk of being there for Jesus, they couldn't even keep watch or stay awake in his most vulnerable hour. Despite their bravado and everyone agreeing that they would die for him, they all fled. And it wasn't just the young Mark that was laid bare and exposed that day. It wasn't just him fleeing in shame. This story makes me think kind of the day that we live in now. There's an increasing pressure for everyone to say the same things and be conservative, right? If you speak out against anything going on in society, you're labeled as someone who hates the church now. Because of the way we believe, the world is preaching tolerance, but they're not tolerant of the church anymore, are they? Because we have our own beliefs. If the world truly was tolerant, like they want everybody else to be, then they would say, okay, you can believe how you want to, let us believe how we want to, and everybody will get along. And that's the way it should be. All I can do is tell them about the good news of the gospel. They can either choose to believe it or not. I will continue to tell them, but it's their choice to believe or not. It's not my job to condemn them. It's not my job to put them down for their choices. I won't ever judge somebody else's sin because it's different than my sin, because I sin every day. And that's the way Christians should be. Unfortunately, and that's why a pastor noted a couple of weeks ago where I said something about I didn't really like being called a Christian anymore. Christian means to be Christ-like, but what's happened in our society is they have turned that into a bad word because we believe a certain way and it's not what they want to. And so now if you call yourself a Christian, they automatically think that you are against everything that they believe in, against them. Now, I am against the acts, the sins, because my Bible tells me to be. But I'm not against them at all. I love each and every one of them because that's what God told me to do. But I am completely against sin. But now, if I weighed 400 pounds and I started telling somebody that being gay is wrong, they could easily turn back and say, being a glutton is probably wrong too. So you can't choose what sin you want to be against. We have to come together and accept the world for who they are, but tell them about the good news. But we can't continuously just judge people for it. And that's what's ended up happening. Well, there's a lot of pressure out there for us to just shut up and don't go along, or to go along with the narrative. A believer isn't called to go with the crowds or the latest woke, and I hate that word. That has become so overused, but it's something that's in our society now. They are called to stand for Jesus and be a witness to the salvation that was provided through his death and resurrection. That's all I can ever do. I was going to hell. Now I'm not. That's what God did for me. He saved my soul. And that's what we're supposed to go out and proclaim to the world. It is God's job to convict them of their sins, not mine. Now, if they ask me if homosexuality or premarital sex or lying or overeating or stealing or any of these things are sin, my job is to say, yeah, it is. That's what the Bible says. But why? Why are those things bad? Because they separate you from God. We're not trying to take fun out of the world. We're just simply saying when you do those things, you separate yourself from God. That's what it should be, not the condemnation that comes with it. So, in ourselves, we are very weak. If we put the same situation as the disciples were, we probably would have run just as well, wouldn't we? Now, I'd like to say, no, I would have stood right there. I would have been that one that didn't. These guys walked with Jesus every single day. If they couldn't stand with Christ when things got tough, I probably would have been the first one out the door, just because of who I am. But yet they did all this too. They ran. But when we see our needs for the Lord, then we can stand in this difficult day. Take courage in the Lord's strength. Be the light and the salt that is desperately needed in our dark times today. So let's see how the theme of nakedness is used in the book of Revelations, in the two main passages. In Laodicea, you got Revelations 3, 17 and 18. Says, because you say, I am rich and I have become wealthy and have need of nothing, and you do not know that you are wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. I advise you to buy from me gold refined by fire so that you may become rich, and white garments so that you may clothe yourself, and that shame of your nakedness will not be revealed, and eye salve to anoint your eyes so that you may see. Here's Jesus' assessment of the church in Laodicea, and it's fair to say it's not a good one. The Laodiceans didn't realize that they were in a bad shape. I remember a story, and I read it to the kids. I always thought it was a weird story. The emperor in his new clothes. Anybody remember that story? You ever heard of it? Okay. So in the story, it's a tale of how two swindlers arrive at a city posing as weavers. And the emperor pays them a lot of money to make him a magnificent new clothes. They gladly agree, and the money, or they get the money, but they tell the emperor and all around that the wonderful clothes they make are invisible to those that are stupid or incompetent. They finally announce that the suit for the emperor is ready, and no one, for fear of being thought stupid, wants to say that they can't see it. They all look intently before finally agreeing how wonderful the new clothes are. The emperor himself doesn't want to say that he can't see the suit because he would look like he's incompetent or stupid. So he goes out parading around in his birthday suit. And finally, a little child brings it up to him that he's naked. And so what happens is, I think of this story, and a lot of times I read the passages about the Laodicean church, and it makes me think of them because they didn't realize that they were naked, spiritually speaking. They thought they were doing great. They thought they were right in there. They were the emperor, dressed in no clothes, thinking they were doing the right thing. Yet, the Bible here clearly says that they were not. They were incredibly wealthy. They had taken care and had no need of anything. So they thought, yet spiritually speaking, it was all a mirage to them. Jesus could see, even if others didn't, that actually they were naked and in desperate need of clothing to hide the shame of their nakedness. And salve for the eyes so they could see, truly see, for they were blind. The Laodicean church was a rich yet unsaved church. How many churches do we have like that nowadays? They've got this wonderful facade. They've got all the bells, the whistles, the buzzer. You go and listen to the preacher and there's no meat there. There's no depth to it. Or he's afraid to preach on sin because he might run some of his people off. Or he's afraid to preach what the Bible teaches us because he's afraid that he'll lose parishioners, which are what? The people paying the bills. So it becomes about that. The churches in our state, or not state, but in our world right now, especially on TV, on the broadcast that we see, even on the radio a lot of times, are truly this emperor. They spiritually think themselves one way, but God sees them as something different. We as Christians need to make sure we never become that. We need to make sure that spiritually speaking, we are clothed. And that we're not naked before the Lord, thinking, "Oh, well, I'm working in the church. I'm here constantly. I'm doing whatever I need to do. I do my duty here at church. I teach a Sunday school class. I pray out loud. I sing in the choir. I do all these things." But spiritually speaking, is it a facade or is it real? Are we doing these things for the right reasons? Are we doing them because God saved me and by gosh, I'll do anything I can for my Lord and Savior because of what He did for me? Or are you doing it as a mirage or a facade just so that you can say, "Look at me, I'm spiritual"? There's a big difference in there, and that's what we're talking about in the Laodicea church. Revelation 16:5 says, "Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his clothes, so that he will not walk about naked, and men will not see his shame." So the second mention of nakedness in Revelation is a warning from the Lord to be found clothed when He returns. In the context of Revelation 16, it likely applies to the second coming, but is still applicable to us as believers today. The Jewish background to this verse is very interesting. John Gill writes this: "The allusion is to the burning of the garments of those priests who were found asleep when upon their watch in the temple." The account that is given is this, okay? The governor of the temple goes around all the wards every night and burning torches before him, and in every ward where the person does not stand upon his feet, the man of the mountain of the house says to him, "Peace be to thee." If he finds him asleep, he strikes him with his staff, and he has the power to burn his clothes. And they say in Jerusalem, "What voice is that in the court?" It is answered, "The voice of a Levite beaten and his clothes burnt, because he slept in the time of his watch." All right, so this is from the Jewish customs. Basically, everyone had to take their turn, or the watch, they had to take their turn. And if he was found asleep, there was somebody who was always going around, and if he found you asleep, he'd crack you one with his rod, and then they'd strip you naked and burn your clothes. And then you couldn't leave your post, but you had to stand there naked. And it was embarrassing. You were ashamed because you had fallen asleep. You put the entire village in jeopardy because of that. And so that's what it's talking about when you read this in Revelation. It says, "Behold, I am coming like a thief in the night. Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his clothes, so that he will not walk about naked, and men will not see his shame." So that's what it's talking about there. So an important duty of the Jewish priest was to stand guard and watch over the temple. I just went over this. The captain of the temple would come unexpectedly like a thief and check that they were, in fact, watchful and alert, hadn't fallen asleep. If they were found asleep, they would struck, okay, their clothes would be removed and burnt, and they had to return home naked and ashamed. So that's what it's talking about. So can you remember how ashamed Adam and Eve were? What'd they do? They went and started again sowing fig leaves. Again, we would have been in a lot of trouble, but they started sowing fig leaves, and then they hid from the Lord when they heard His voice. This is a pointer to the shame that the unclothed will have at the return of the Lord too. Can you imagine sitting here in church and all of a sudden we hear that trumpet sound. And half the church or a third of the church or a fifth of the church is gone like that, and you're sitting there. That's like being naked when that thief comes, right? Because you weren't truly ready. And that's what we as Christians, and I assume that everybody that especially willing to come to Sunday school on a Sunday morning truly knows the Lord. But the counts now, if you talk to any preacher, any evangelist, they're saying that maybe a tenth of the members of churches are truly saved. Can you imagine that day when that trump sounds and you're still left there, sitting here? The embarrassment, the shame that you'll feel because you truly don't know the Lord. You're just a facade. And there's going to be people like that. There's going to be people in the church. There's going to be preachers standing in a pulpit when that trump sounds, and they're going to still be standing in that pulpit after the sound of the trumpet because they truly don't know God. And that's where we have to make sure that we won't be naked and ashamed. And that's what it's all about. That is a pointer to the shame of the unclothed will have when the Lord returns. Clothing for the believer is twofold. A true believer has the clothing of Jesus' righteousness, and it'll never be taken away. That's the beauty of it. I didn't have to do anything. He gave me His righteousness, and He clothed me in that as a believer. So I don't ever have to fear losing that. I know some of you have come from a background where it was taught you could lose your salvation. And I can't imagine. I grew up being saved every Sunday. I grew up in a Baptist church where we preached hellfire and brimstone every Sunday morning. You got saved again because he was just preaching salvation. I don't know if any of you have ever came from a church like that, but the man that I got saved under, Brother Les Chadwick, great man of God, but literally it was hellfire and brimstone every Sunday. You were going to hell. He was talking about hell. He was talking about sin. And if you came to his church, you knew that you were saved, because it was pounded in every single Sunday. There are churches out there that say that you sin one time, you have to go get resaved again. I can't imagine living like that because I grew up in a way to where I knew that what I got from God, God gave it to me. What's weird is the older I've gotten, there's been times where I've doubted that I've actually said, how could I do and think the way I think and truly be saved? And I know Satan plays with us. He wants us to doubt what God has done for us. And I know that's where I was. But to have grown up in a society or in a church that teaches you could lose something that God gave you, I don't even understand that. I don't understand that at all. I've looked at those religions. I've understood what they're pulling the scriptures from, but it makes zero sense to me because God, just right here, God clothes us in His righteousness. It wasn't anything I did. How can I lose it if I didn't have to do anything to gain it? You know, it's something that God did for me. So for those that do struggle with that, that's got to be a tough life. I've been around, I know a family right now that part of our family, extended family, that they truly believe they can lose their salvation. I can't imagine ever wanting to go to sleep for fear of not waking up if I could lose my salvation. You know what I mean? Because what if I sinned right before I went to sleep, thought some evil thought, and lost my salvation, then I didn't wake up. It's all over. So there's no security in that. But God gives us security in His righteousness. And that's what we can have as Christians, or what we should have. Like I said, I think we all doubt it at times. I think we all question how we could sin and still be saved. But the Bible teaches us that that is part of our lives. But there isn't still, now that's one part. With His righteousness, it can never be taken away. But there's still that outworking of the salvation through God-ordained righteous acts, which are important. Revelation 19:8 says, "And to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints." Okay? So, as a type, who are the priests today? What is the temple today? All true believers are priests today. We have the same call as the Levitical priest of old to keep watch over the temple. Yet today, we are the temple, right? So we are called to be watchful over our own temple. It says your body is your temple, right? And so we still have that same responsibility to keep watch over ourselves. So we need to be spiritually awake and watchful and ready. All the things, incidentally, that Jesus' disciples failed to do in the Garden of Gethsemane, leading up to the incident of Mark losing his clothes, we need to abide in that relationship with the Lord so that when He appears, we may be confident and found watchful, a good and faithful servant. So now you think about that priest sitting on that wall, watchful for his entire nation to be safe. We have to do the same thing spiritually within our own lives. We have to make sure that we're watchful, that we won't be found asleep at that calling. Now, are we going to lose our salvation? No. But will we lose rewards? Yes, we can at that time. 1 Corinthians 3:11-15 says, "For no man can lay a foundation other than that one which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if any man builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stone, wood, hay, and straw, each man's work will become evident, for the day will show it, because it too will be revealed with fire. And the fire itself will test the quality of each man's work. If any man's work which he has built up or built on it remains, he will receive a reward. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss. But he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire." So, I've actually, I think a while back, I taught about the Bema seat of Christ. And so hopefully this is not something new. But as priests today, which is what we are, believers don't have their clothes burned up or set on fire like the guy that fell asleep and got smacked on the head and got his clothes ripped off of him, and they burnt those off and he had to go home naked. But what happens is that our works still have to pass through a fire. And that's where we stand before the Bema seat of Christ one day. And so those works that I mentioned earlier, all the things that we can do in the church, if we're doing those for the right reasons, if we're doing those with a pure heart, if we're doing those because of what God did for us, those are works that we'll be rewarded for. If you get your get out of jail free card and then you say, "I'm done, I'm going to heaven. I got my righteous clothes on, I'm going to heaven. I'm done." Well, guess what? Your works for the rest of your life, good or bad, you'll still stand before the Bema seat of Christ, and those will be judged. What you do in this life after you're saved will still be judged, but it would be for rewards. Now, my brother-in-law is one of these guys who, he used to talk about this a lot, and I probably didn't understand it as good as I do now. He was constantly, he's been to Africa doing evangelism, seeing hundreds of souls saved. He did a lot of different things, and I probably didn't understand it like I do now, but what's happened is when we look at this, what we see is what we do for Christ are our works. That doesn't save us, but it does give us rewards. Can you imagine being able to go in and take that crown of righteousness that you get for a reward that you've done here on earth, for teaching Awana's kids or working with the Awana kids or going in a bus to pick them up to bring them to church? When you get to heaven and that kid says, "Thank you. Thank you for coming and picking me up. I'm here because you drove the bus." And that crown you get to lay at Christ's feet and say, "Thank you, Lord, for this." It's not that we're going to build up and have a big storehouse of crowns of gold in heaven. It's not going to do us any good. But what it does is it rewards us for the works that we've done here. Do you want to get there and just say, "Man, I got in by the skin of my teeth. I'm happy to be here"? Or do you want to be able to say, "Lord, thank you. And here's these crowns because of what you did for me"? That's what it's talking about when we stand before the Bema seat one day. It's an examination of your works for the purpose of rewards. So in that sense, our lives will be tried by fire. Could believers not have, or who have nothing to show for their life as a Christian, feel shame on that day? I don't know. The verse above says that they will suffer loss. Saved, but as one escaping through the fire with nothing else to show for it. It gives the same type of imagery as a Levitical priest who had his clothes burned up and had to go home naked. So it's possible that there could be some type of feeling of shame on that day. John picks it up when he wrote in 1 John 2:28. He says, "Now little children, abide in him, so that when he appears, we may have confidence and not shrink away from him in shame at his coming." But we need to be careful when we speak of shame. Shame can be a powerful tool in the hand of the enemy. That's what I was talking about earlier. You can be ashamed of a sin as a Christian and go, "Ooh, I must not be saved." And I think that's what's happened to me in my life a few times. And the enemy can take that. He reminds us of sins and failures to keep us bound in shame so that we don't do things. Can you imagine doing something in your past and you think, you can either take that and grow as a Christian and use that and say, look what God brought me out of. Or you can say, I can't do anything in the church because they might actually find out about this and look at the shame that this will cause me. Michael, you're aware of this.
Many times.
So the enemy will use our past failures to shame us, to keep us from doing what we need to do for Christ at times. And that's not the way it should be. That's why the Bible talks about being truthful, not telling lies, telling other people the truth. What we did in our past is shameful, the sins that we've done. But God forgave us. But when we try to hide those, sometimes they can come back and bite us in the future. Arthur Conan Doyle. I like this. The ingenious creator of Sherlock Holmes mystery, once found great humor in a practical joke that he played on 12 famous friends. Each of these men were virtuous and highly respected. For the joke, Doyle sent every one of them the same telegram. Fly at once, all is discovered. That's all he sent them. So he told them, he said, you better run. Everybody knows everything. Within 24 hours, the dozen men of noble reputation had all left the country. And it was just a joke. But all of them evidently had a past that they didn't want people to find out about. Now, I'm about halfway through. No, I'm not. I'm close. Let me finish this. Let me say this. To conclude, we saw at the beginning that Adam and Eve immediately felt shame and fear for their nakedness before the Lord after their disobedience and fall. The young man, likely Mark, lost his garments and felt shame at going home naked. This, I believe, represents all the disciples at that stage who, despite the words, had deserted Jesus. As believers, we do stand in the righteous clothing of Christ, but we also want to have acts of righteousness, which the Lord himself has prepared for us beforehand on the day of his return. We could say that at the Lord's return, there will be the good, the bad, and the ugly. There'll be things that we'll be happy about. There'll be things that we'll be saved from, but not really rewarded. And then, of course, there's going to be things that we didn't offer up that we should have on that day because of the fact that we just didn't do what we were supposed to do. We should never be worried about our salvation. If we truly are saved, then we don't have to fear losing that righteous clothing. We don't have to fear being naked before the Lord because we have that garment of righteousness that God gave us the moment we got saved. The other side of that is we will stand before Him and things will be burned up. You will stand before Him, and whether you've experienced shame or not, I don't know. The Bible is kind of not 100% clear. There are passages that point to where you will stand there and have to say, Lord, I'm ashamed I don't have more that I've done for you, that I've given you. Again, it's not works to get salvation. It's works because of salvation. Make sure you always figure that out. But